The early morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse parking lot as Judge Richard Harrison's black Mercedes pulled up to the entrance. His day had started like any other. Coffee in hand, briefcase on the passenger seat, and his usual scowl firmly in place. At 62 years old, with graying hair and stern features, Harrison had earned a reputation as one of the strictest judges in the state. As he approached his reserved parking space, marked clearly with Chief Judge Harrison in fresh white paint, he noticed a sleek, dark blue Tesla occupying his spot. His face reddened instantly, and his coffee-holding hand began to shake with anger. In his 15 years as Chief Judge, no one had ever dared to park in his space. "Unbelievable," he muttered, parking his car in a visitor's spot instead. Harrison stomped toward the Tesla, his polished black shoes clicking against the asphalt. He pulled out his official citation pad, something he kept handy for situations exactly like this, and began writing a ticket with particularly aggressive strokes of his pen. At that exact moment, Sarah Bennett was rushing through the courthouse's side entrance, her arms full of legal documents and her phone pressed between her ear and shoulder. At 42, she had already accomplished more than most lawyers would in a lifetime. Her crisp navy suit and perfectly styled hair reflected her attention to detail, while her confident stride spoke of someone used to commanding respect. "Yes, I understand the urgency," she spoke into the phone, her voice calm but authoritative. "That's exactly why I came in early for the emergency board meeting. We need to address these judiciary misconduct allegations immediately." She juggled her files, trying to fish out her car keys. "I'll head down to move my car as soon as this call ends." Back in the parking lot, Judge Harrison was adding extra violations to the ticket. He checked boxes for unauthorized parking, disrespect of judicial property, and obstruction of justice, the last one being completely inappropriate for a parking violation, but he was too angry to care. The fine total came to $750, much higher than any standard parking ticket. From the courthouse window, several legal clerks watched the scene unfold. They recognized Sarah's car but remained silent, some secretly hoping to witness the aftermath of Harrison's mistake. "Should we warn him?" whispered Jenny, a first-year clerk, to her colleague. "And miss this show," responded Mark, a senior clerk. "He's about to learn a valuable lesson about making assumptions." Judge Harrison finished writing the ticket with a flourish, slapping it under the Tesla's windshield wiper with unnecessary force. He added a personal note at the bottom: "Next time, show some respect for the law." The irony of his own abuse of power was completely lost on him. Sarah's meeting ran longer than expected, discussing serious matters about judicial conduct across the state. As board chairperson of the State Judicial Review Committee, she took her responsibilities seriously. The emergency meeting had been called to address complaints about discrimination in several courtrooms, including, ironically, some concerns about Judge Harrison's courtroom. When she finally ended her call and reached her car, Sarah spotted the ticket. Reading through Harrison's excessive citations, a slight smile crossed her face. She had dealt with such behavior throughout her career. People making assumptions, jumping to conclusions, exercising power without consideration. But as chairperson of the board that oversees judicial conduct, she was now in a position to address these issues systemically. She carefully folded the ticket and placed it in her briefcase. Sarah had a scheduled appearance in Judge Harrison's courtroom that very morning for a routine case. She checked her watch. She had just enough time to prepare for what would surely be an interesting encounter. Inside his chambers, Judge Harrison was already reviewing his morning docket, feeling satisfied about the ticket he'd issued. He had no idea that his hasty actions were about to lead to one of the most humbling experiences of his career. As he sipped his now cold coffee, he remained blissfully unaware that the owner of the Tesla would be standing in his courtroom in less than an hour, and that his entire perspective on authority, respect, and judgment was about to change dramatically. Judge Harrison's courtroom buzzed with the usual morning activity. Lawyers shuffled papers, clients whispered nervously to their attorneys, and the court clerk organized the day's cases. The judge sat high on his bench, looking down at everyone with his typical stern expression. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Case number 2024 CV 156, Thompson versus Miller, called out the court clerk, her voice echoing through the spacious courtroom. Sarah Bennett stood gracefully, her case files neatly arranged before her. Ready for the plaintiff, Your Honor, she announced clearly. Several heads turned to look at her. It wasn't often that someone of her status appeared for a routine civil case. Judge Harrison barely glanced up from his papers. "You're 3 minutes late, Counselor," he said sharply, still not really looking at her. "This court starts precisely at 9:00 a.m. "My apologies, Your Honor," Sarah replied calmly. "I was actually in the building early this morning for an emergency board meeting." "I'm not interested in excuses," Harrison cut her off, finally looking up. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her. There was no sign of recognition. "In fact, since you mentioned being in the building early, would you happen to know anything about a Tesla parked in the Chief Judge's space this morning?" A subtle smile played at the corners of Sarah's mouth. "Yes, Your Honor. That would be my car." The courtroom fell silent. Even the usual shuffle of papers stopped. Judge Harrison's face reddened slightly, but he pressed on, trying to maintain his authority. "Well, then, Counselor, in addition to being late to my courtroom, you've shown complete disregard for courthouse procedures. I've already issued a ticket for $750, and I'm adding another $250 fine for contempt." Sarah remained perfectly composed. "Your Honor, if I may explain." "You may not," Harrison interrupted again, his voice growing louder. "This kind of behavior shows a lack of respect for this court and the entire judicial system. Perhaps this will teach you to pay attention to parking signs in the future." Several attorneys in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few exchanged knowing looks. They were well aware of who Sarah Bennett was, even if Judge Harrison wasn't. "Your Honor," Sarah tried one more time, her voice firm but professional. "As I was trying to explain, I had explicit permission to park there this morning. You see." "Ms. Bennett," Harrison's voice boomed through the courtroom. "One more word about this, and I'll double the contempt fine. Now, shall we proceed with the case at hand, or would you like to continue wasting this court's time?" Sarah straightened her jacket and took a deep breath. "We can proceed, Your Honor. However, I will need to leave precisely at 10:30 a.m. for the State Judicial Review Board meeting, where, as chairperson, I need to review several matters of judicial conduct." The words hung in the air like heavy smoke. Judge Harrison's face went from red to pale in seconds. His hands, which had been shuffling papers, froze mid-motion. Around the courtroom, several people tried to hide their smiles. "You're the board chairperson?" Harrison's voice had lost all its previous authority. "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied professionally. "The same board that oversees all judicial conduct in this state, including parking violation protocols and appropriate fine structures." She paused briefly. "Now, shall we discuss the Thompson case?" Judge Harrison's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The power dynamic in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. The court clerk quickly buried her face in her computer screen, trying to hide her amusement. Finally, Harrison managed to speak, his voice noticeably softer. "Yes, of course, Counselor. Please proceed with your case." As Sarah began her opening statement, the morning's parking ticket felt very heavy in her briefcase. She knew this incident would need to be addressed, but not here, not now. There would be time for that discussion later, in a different room, where she would be the one sitting at the head of the table. The rest of the hearing proceeded without further interruption, though Judge Harrison seemed to have lost his earlier bravado. Every time he looked at Sarah, he seemed to shrink a little more in his chair, already dreading the board meeting that was yet to come. At exactly 10:30 a.m., Judge Harrison stood outside the State Judicial Review Board's meeting room, his hands nervously adjusting his tie. The morning's events kept replaying in his mind, making his stomach turn. The nameplate beside the door read Sarah Bennett, board chairperson, and now it seemed to mock him. Inside the room, Sarah was already seated at the head of the long mahogany table, surrounded by other board members. Her laptop was open, and several documents were neatly arranged before her. The parking ticket from that morning sat prominently on top of the pile. "Come in, Judge Harrison," Sarah called out when she noticed him hovering in the doorway. Her voice was professional, showing no sign of their earlier confrontation. Harrison walked in slowly, feeling like a student called to the principal's office. The other board members watched him with varying expressions, some curious, others disapproving. News of the morning's parking incident had apparently traveled fast. Please, take a seat. Sarah gestured to the empty chair directly across from her. We have several matters to discuss today. Judge Harrison sat down, noticing how his usual confidence had abandoned him. The room felt uncomfortably warm, and he could feel sweat forming on his forehead. Before we begin our regular quarterly review, Sarah started, I believe we should address what happened this morning. She picked up the parking ticket, holding it so everyone could see. Would you like to explain your actions, Judge Harrison? The other board members leaned forward slightly, eager to hear his response. Harrison tugged at his collar, which suddenly felt too tight. I admit I acted hastily, he began, his voice lacking its usual authority. Had I known who you were? That's precisely the problem, isn't it? Sarah interrupted gently. The issue isn't that you didn't recognize me. The issue is how quickly you jumped to conclusions and abused your power. One of the board members, Judge Martinez, spoke up. Richard, you cited someone for obstruction of justice over a parking space and then added contempt of court during a hearing. Harrison's face reddened again, but this time from shame rather than anger. I let my temper get the best of me, he admitted quietly. Sarah opened a folder on her laptop. Unfortunately, this isn't an isolated incident. We've received several complaints about similar behavior in your courtroom. She turned the screen so everyone could see. There seems to be a pattern of hasty judgments and disproportionate penalties, particularly with certain demographics. The room grew silent as graphs and statistics appeared on the large screen behind Sarah. The data showed clear patterns in Judge Harrison's courtroom decisions, patterns he had never noticed himself. I had no idea, Harrison stammered, staring at the numbers that seemed to tell an uncomfortable truth about his behavior. Most of us don't, Sarah replied kindly. That's why these review sessions are so important. They help us see our blind spots. She paused, letting her words sink in. This morning's incident, while unfortunate, provides us with an opportunity. The other board members nodded in agreement. Judge Martinez even smiled encouragingly at Harrison, who looked completely deflated. An opportunity? Harrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Sarah continued. An opportunity to acknowledge our biases and work to overcome them, to remember that true justice requires us to look beyond our immediate assumptions. She placed the parking ticket back on the table. Would you agree, Judge Harrison? He nodded slowly, finally understanding the full impact of his actions. The morning's parking ticket now seemed like a mirror, reflecting back all the times he might have acted without proper consideration. I would like to apologize, he said, looking directly at Sarah for the first time since entering the room. Not just for this morning, but for all the times I may have let my prejudices affect my judgment. Sarah smiled warmly. Apology accepted. Now, shall we discuss how we can turn this incident into a learning opportunity for the entire judiciary? As the meeting continued, Judge Harrison felt something changing inside him. His embarrassment was slowly being replaced by determination. Determination to do better, to be better. He realized that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most humbling experiences. As the board meeting continued into its second hour, the full weight of Judge Harrison's actions began to sink in. Sarah Bennett had just finished presenting a comprehensive review of his case history over the past 5 years. The numbers on the screen told a story he had never noticed before, one of unconscious bias and hasty judgments. Looking at these statistics, Sarah explained, pointing to a graph, we can see that defendants from minority communities received, on average, 40% higher fines in your courtroom compared to others for similar offenses. Harrison stared at the numbers, feeling a cold sensation in his stomach. He thought about all the lives he had affected, all the people who had stood before him, hoping for fair treatment. I never realized, he said softly, more to himself than to the room. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. Judge Martinez, who had known Harrison for 20 years, spoke up. Richard, we've all had our moments of revelation. What matters is what we do after we recognize our mistakes. The room fell silent as Sarah walked to the window, looking out at the courthouse where she had faced discrimination countless times throughout her career. She turned back to face the group, her expression thoughtful. Judge Harrison, do you remember Mrs. Thompson from your courtroom last month? She asked. Harrison nodded, recalling the elderly black woman who had been fighting an eviction notice. You fined her $500 for being 5 minutes late to her hearing, Sarah continued. She had taken 3 buses to get to court that day, and her last bus was delayed due to a traffic accident. The memory hit Harrison like a physical blow. He remembered his impatience that day, his quick dismissal of her explanation. I didn't even let her finish explaining, he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. Sarah pulled out another file. Mrs. Thompson had to choose between paying for her heart medication that month or paying your fine. She chose to pay the fine, out of fear of facing more severe penalties. She ended up in the emergency room 2 weeks later. Several board members shook their heads sadly. Harrison felt sick to his stomach. Is she all right? He managed to ask. She recovered, Sarah replied. But her story is just one of many. This morning, when you saw my Tesla in your parking spot, what was your first assumption about its owner? Harrison's face flushed with shame. I assumed someone was being disrespectful, breaking rules deliberately. I never considered there might be a valid reason. Just like you didn't consider Mrs. Thompson's circumstances, Sarah added gently. Or the circumstances of countless others who have appeared in your courtroom. One of the younger board members, Lisa Chen, spoke up. I think we're witnessing an important moment here. Judge Harrison, your willingness to acknowledge these issues is the first step toward real change. Harrison looked around the room, seeing understanding faces instead of the judgment he had expected. These colleagues, these peers, were offering him a chance to learn and grow. The parking incident this morning, Sarah continued, while unfortunate, has given us a unique opportunity. Sometimes we need to experience something personally to truly understand its impact. Judge Martinez nodded in agreement. We've all had our blind spots, Richard. The question is, what are you going to do about yours? Harrison straightened in his chair, feeling a new sense of purpose. I want to make this right, he said firmly. Not just with you, Ms. Bennett, but with everyone who enters my courtroom. I need to do better. Sarah smiled, picking up the parking ticket from her desk. She tore it in half, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Then let's talk about how we can make that happen. Real change requires more than just good intentions. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, Judge Harrison realized that this day, which had started with him writing an angry parking ticket, would mark a turning point in his career. The revelation wasn't just about his biases. It was about the responsibility he held as a judge to ensure true justice for everyone. I'm ready to listen, he said, taking out his notebook. I'm ready to learn. Sarah Bennett stood at the front of the boardroom, her laser pointer highlighting key statistics on the screen. After the emotional revelations of the past hour, she had steered the meeting toward practical solutions. Judge Harrison sat attentively, his usual authoritative demeanor replaced by genuine interest. Let's look at some real numbers, Sarah began, clicking to a new slide. In our state alone, minorities are 3 times more likely to receive maximum penalties for minor offenses. This isn't just about one judge or one courthouse. It's a systemic issue. The room was quiet except for the sound of pens scratching on notepads. Harrison found himself writing extensively, something he hadn't done since his law school days. But today, Sarah continued, we have a unique opportunity. Judge Harrison's experience this morning gives us a perfect case study. Sometimes it takes walking in someone else's shoes to understand their perspective. Harrison raised his hand, something that would have seemed beneath him just hours ago. May I share something with the group? Sarah nodded encouragingly. Please do. This morning, he began, his voice softer than usual. When I wrote that ticket, I never once considered asking why someone was parked in my spot. I just assumed. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I assumed I was dealing with someone who didn't respect authority, someone who didn't belong there. Judge Martinez leaned forward. And how did that assumption change when you learned who Ms. Bennett was? That's just it, Harrison replied, shaking his head. It shouldn't have mattered who she was. Whether she was the board chairperson or a first-year law clerk, I should have approached the situation with the same level of respect and consideration. Sarah smiled, pleased with his insight. Exactly. Now, let's apply that same thinking to your courtroom. Tell us about a recent case that stands out to you. Harrison thought for a moment. Last week, I had a young man in my court for a traffic violation. He was wearing baggy clothes, had tattoos. He stopped, suddenly aware of his own prejudices. I interrupted him 3 times during his explanation and doubled his fine because I felt he was being disrespectful. And was he actually being disrespectful? Sarah asked gently. No, Harrison admitted. Looking back, he was trying to explain that he was rushing to pick up his daughter from school because his wife had been in an accident. I never let him finish. Lisa Chin, the young board member, spoke up. This is exactly why we need to implement better training programs. We all carry biases, but we can learn to recognize and counter them. Sarah clicked to another slide showing a training program outline. Which brings us to our proposal. We want to develop a comprehensive training series on implicit bias and its impact on judicial decisions. Judge Harrison, would you be willing to share your experience as part of this training? Harrison looked surprised. You want me to, but I'm the one who made the mistake. Sometimes the best teachers are those who have learned from their mistakes, Sarah replied. Your story, our story from this morning, could help other judges recognize their own biases before they impact someone's life. The room buzzed with positive energy as board members began discussing the training program's potential impact. Harrison found himself contributing ideas, drawing from his own revelations. We could include role reversal exercises, he suggested. Similar to what I experienced today, it's eye-opening to suddenly find yourself on the other side of authority. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's an excellent suggestion. Sometimes we need to feel vulnerable to understand the impact of our actions. As the discussion continued, Harrison noticed how different this meeting felt from any other he'd attended. There was no defensive posturing, no trying to maintain appearances, just honest dialogue about making real changes. Miss Bennett, he said during a brief pause, I have to ask, when you saw that ticket on your car this morning, did you know how this day would unfold? Sarah's eyes twinkled with wisdom. Let's just say I recognized an opportunity for growth. Sometimes the best lessons come from unexpected places, even a parking ticket. The room filled with gentle laughter, and Harrison found himself joining in. For the first time in his career, he felt like he was part of something truly meaningful, not just enforcing laws, but ensuring justice was served with understanding and compassion. That evening, Judge Harrison sat alone in his chambers, the events of the day weighing heavily on his mind. The room that had always felt like his fortress of authority now seemed different. Even the large leather chair behind his desk didn't feel quite as comfortable as before. He opened his laptop and began reviewing his recent cases. With his new perspective, each file told a different story than the one he'd seen before. He stopped at a case from last Tuesday, a young Hispanic woman who had been late to her hearing. 3 months, he muttered to himself, remembering how he'd suspended her driver's license. I didn't even ask why she was late. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter, Catherine, a first-year law student. Dad, heard about what happened today. Can we talk? Harrison sighed and called her. When she answered, her voice was gentle but firm. Dad, are you okay? I'm fine, sweetheart, he replied, staring out his office window at the setting sun. Just doing some thinking. The whole law school is talking about it, Catherine said. But you know what? They're not making fun of you. They're saying it's brave, how you handled it afterward. Harrison felt a lump in his throat. Brave? I made a fool of myself, Catherine. All these years on the bench, and I never saw what I was doing. But you see it now, Dad, she insisted. That's what matters. Remember what you told me when I failed my first practice exam. It's not about the mistake, it's about what you learn from it. He smiled, hearing his own words echoed back to him. When did you get so wise? I had a pretty good teacher, she replied, even if he's still learning himself. After hanging up, Harrison pulled out his court calendar for the next day. 10 cases were scheduled: traffic violations, small claims, minor disputes. In the past, you would have seen them as simple cases to clear quickly. Now, he saw 10 opportunities to do better. He began writing notes next to each case. Ask about circumstances. Listen fully before deciding. Consider alternative explanations. Simple reminders, but they felt revolutionary. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Mark, the senior clerk who had witnessed the morning's parking incident. Judge Harrison, I'm heading out, but I wanted to check if you needed anything. Harrison gestured for him to come in. Mark, how long have you worked in this courthouse? 12 years, Your Honor. And in those 12 years, how many times have you seen me make snap judgments? Be honest. Mark shifted uncomfortably, but answered truthfully. Quite often, sir. But if it helps, I've seen you change more today than in all those 12 years combined. Harrison nodded slowly. I've been thinking about Mrs. Rodriguez's case from last week. The one with the expired business license? Yes, sir. You fined her $2,000. Call her first thing tomorrow. Tell her I'm reviewing her case. And Mark? Harrison added as the clerk turned to leave. Thank you for being honest. Alone again, Harrison pulled out the torn pieces of the parking ticket that Sarah had returned to him. He pinned them to his bulletin board, a reminder of the day everything changed. He thought about all the faces that had passed through his courtroom over the years. How many stories had he missed? How many lives had been affected by his rushed judgments? Opening his email, he began typing a message to the entire courthouse staff. Starting tomorrow, we're implementing new procedures in my courtroom. Every person who comes before this bench deserves to be heard, truly heard. I failed at this in the past, but that changes now. As he typed, Harrison felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The pure, simple desire to do justice, not just pass judgment. The parking space incident that had seemed like such a humiliation that morning had become something else entirely, a gift of perspective. Looking at his reflection in the window, Harrison saw a different judge than the one who had arrived that morning. The stern, authoritative mask had cracked, revealing something more human underneath. Tomorrow would be a new day in his courtroom, and for the first time in years, he was looking forward to it. 1 week after the parking incident, Judge Harrison's courtroom looked the same but felt entirely different. The wooden benches were still worn smooth from years of use. The American flag still stood proud in the corner, but there was a new energy in the air. Sarah Bennett sat in the back row, quietly observing. She had come to see if the changes they had discussed were more than just good intentions. What she saw brought a smile to her face. Good morning, everyone, Harrison addressed the crowded courtroom. Before we begin today's proceedings, I want to make something clear. This is a place of justice, not just law. Everyone here has the right to be heard and treated with respect. The first case involved a young mother named Maria Santos, charged with driving with an expired license. In the past, Harrison would have simply issued the standard fine. Today was different. Ms. Santos, he said gently, can you tell me why you weren't able to renew your license? Maria, who had been nervously clutching her purse, looked surprised at the question. I tried 3 times, Your Honor, but the DMV is only open during my work hours, and I can't take time off. I'm a single mother, and my job doesn't offer paid leave. In the past, Harrison would have considered this an excuse. Now, he saw it as what it was, a real person facing real challenges. Thank you for explaining, he said. Let's work on a solution. We have a new program that helps people handle DMV matters during evening hours. Would that help your situation? Maria's eyes filled with tears of relief. Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. From her seat, Sarah nodded approvingly. The training program they had developed was already showing results. Harrison wasn't just changing his own behavior, he was changing the entire atmosphere of his courtroom. During the lunch break, Sarah approached Harrison's chambers. She found him reviewing case files with a new set of post-it notes on his desk. Each one had a simple question written on it. What's their story? What barriers are they facing? How can we help? Quite a difference from last week, Sarah commented. Harrison looked up, smiling slightly. Ms. Bennett, or should I say, my parking space guardian angel? They both laughed, the tension from last week completely gone. We've had 27 cases this morning, Harrison said, and do you know what I realized? In the past, I would have handled them all the same way, by the book, no exceptions. But every single one had a unique story that deserved to be heard. Sarah sat down across from him. The other judges have noticed. 3 of them have already asked to join our training program. Really? Harrison's eyes lit up. You know, I've been thinking about expanding it. Maybe we could create a community advisory board. Get input from the people who actually appear in our courtrooms. Now that's, Sarah smiled. Sounds like something the State Judicial Review Board would be very interested in supporting. Just then, Mark, the clerk, appeared at the door. Judge Harrison? Mrs. Thompson is here. The one from last month's eviction case. Harrison exchanged a quick glance with Sarah. Send her in, please. Mrs. Thompson entered slowly, leaning on her cane. Before she could speak, Harrison stood up. Mrs. Thompson, I owe you an apology, he said. And more than that, I owe you a refund of the fine I unfairly imposed. The elderly woman looked stunned. I didn't come for that, Judge. I came because I heard things were different now. I wanted to see for myself. Things are different, Sarah confirmed. And they're going to keep changing. Harrison reached into his desk and pulled out an envelope. This contains your refund, plus the cost of your medical bills from when you missed your medication. It's not just about the money, Mrs. Thompson. It's about making things right. As Mrs. Thompson left the chambers, wiping tears from her eyes, Harrison turned to Sarah. You know, when you parked in my spot last week, you did more than teach one judge a lesson. You started a movement. Sarah smiled. Sometimes justice needs a little parking violation to get moving in the right direction. They both laughed, knowing that what had started as a confrontation had evolved into something much more important, a real chance for change. 6 months had passed since the parking incident, and the changes in the state courthouse went far beyond one judge's courtroom. On a bright morning, Sarah Bennett stood at a podium in the courthouse's main conference room, addressing a packed audience of judges, lawyers, and community members. When we started this journey, she began, gesturing to the presentation screen behind her, we had a simple goal: to make our justice system truly just. Today, I'm proud to share our progress. In the front row, Judge Harrison sat with perfect posture, but his face had softened considerably from the stern mask he used to wear. Next to him sat his daughter Catherine, now interning with the State Judicial Review Board. In the past 6 months, Sarah continued, we've seen a 70% reduction in bias-related complaints. Our new evening court programs have helped over 500 working families resolve their legal issues without losing wages. But numbers only tell part of the story. She clicked to the next slide, showing a familiar face, Mrs. Thompson, smiling broadly. Our Community Advisory Board, led by Mrs. Thompson, has transformed how we handle cases. We're not just passing judgment anymore, we're finding solutions. Judge Harrison stood up when Sarah called his name. And none of this would have been possible without Judge Harrison's courage to acknowledge his mistakes and work for real change. Judge, would you like to share your thoughts? Harrison walked to the podium, pulling out his reading glasses. 6 months ago, I wrote a parking ticket that changed my life. A gentle laugh rippled through the audience. I thought I was punishing someone who didn't respect authority. Instead, I learned the true meaning of respect and authority. He looked around the room, making eye contact with various people. In my courtroom now, we have a new rule. Before making any decision, we ask 3 questions. Have we truly listened? Have we understood the whole story? And most importantly, are we helping or just punishing? From her seat in the audience, Maria Santos, the young mother from that first week, nodded in agreement. She now worked as a volunteer translator for the evening court program, helping others navigate the system she had once feared. Our success here has caught national attention, Sarah announced, returning to the podium. 5 other state courts have requested our training program, and the Federal Judicial Center has expressed interest in implementing our Community Advisory Board model nationwide. Catherine leaned over to her father and whispered, "Not bad for a parking violation, huh, Dad?" Harrison smiled, remembering how angry he'd been that morning 6 months ago. His reserved parking space was now gone, converted into a drop-off zone for elderly and disabled court visitors, with Mrs. Thompson's name on the sign. After the presentation, people gathered in small groups, sharing stories and ideas. Judge Martinez approached Harrison with a broad smile. "Remember when you used to say the law was black and white, Richard? Now I know it's filled with every color imaginable," Harrison replied. "And each color has its own story." Sarah joined them, carrying a familiar piece of paper, a torn parking ticket, now framed. "This is going up in the training center," she announced. A reminder that change can start in the most unexpected places. As the crowd thinned out, a young intern approached Harrison nervously. "Sir, there's someone in your spot. I mean, the disabled drop-off zone. Should I call security?" Harrison and Sarah exchanged amused glances. "No," they said in unison. Let's go hear their story first. Walking through the courthouse halls, Harrison noticed something he'd missed in all his years on the bench. The walls were lined with faces, photographs of judges, lawyers, and court staff from throughout the years. Once, he'd seen them as symbols of authority. Now he saw them as reminders of responsibility. You know, he said to Sarah as they reached the courthouse steps, that parking space was the smallest part of my territory, but defending it made me lose sight of my